My son said, "The family BBQ was postponed, don't come over." But I showed up and caught them. My name is Margaret. I'm 58 years old, and I'm about to tell you the story that completely shattered everything I believed about my family. If you're watching this while cooking dinner or scrolling during your lunch break, please hit that like button and subscribe, because what I'm about to share will make you question everything you think you know about the people closest to you. It was a beautiful Saturday morning in suburban Denver, Colorado. The kind of day where the Rocky Mountains looked like a postcard backdrop and the air smelled of barbecue smoke from neighboring yards. I had been looking forward to our monthly family BBQ for weeks. After my husband Tom passed away 3 years ago, these gatherings became my lifeline, the one constant that kept me connected to my children and grandchildren. I was in my kitchen, carefully preparing my famous potato salad that everyone always raved about. The recipe had been passed down from my grandmother, and I took pride in the fact that no family gathering felt complete without it. The potatoes were perfectly tender, the dressing had just the right amount of tang, and I had even splurged on the expensive paprika that made it look picture perfect. My phone buzzed around 10 a.m. It was a text from my eldest son, David. "Hey Mom, sorry, but we need to postpone today's BBQ. Sarah came down with something and we don't want to risk spreading it. Rain check for next weekend?" I stared at the message, feeling that familiar pang of disappointment wash over me. Sarah was David's wife, and while I understood the concern about illness, something felt off. She had seemed perfectly fine when we spoke on Thursday, but I pushed those thoughts aside. After all, people can get sick quickly, and it was responsible of them to be cautious. "Of course, sweetheart. Tell Sarah I hope she feels better soon. Love you," I replied, adding a heart emoji that my granddaughter Emma had taught me to use. I stood in my kitchen, looking at the spread I had prepared: the potato salad, a fresh fruit bowl, homemade dinner rolls that were halfway through rising, and a chocolate cake that had taken me 3 hours to decorate. The silence in my house suddenly felt deafening. Since Tom's death, these family gatherings had become more than just social occasions. They were my anchor, my purpose, my reminder that I wasn't alone in this world. But then I remembered something that made my stomach twist with an emotion I couldn't quite name. Earlier that week at the grocery store, I had run into my neighbor, Mrs. Henderson. She had mentioned seeing moving trucks at David's house. When I asked David about it during our Thursday call, he had brushed it off, saying they were just having some furniture delivered. But Mrs. Henderson had been quite specific. She said it looked like someone was moving out, not in. The more I thought about it, the more pieces started forming a disturbing picture. David's phone calls had become shorter and more infrequent. When I visited last month, Sarah seemed distant, almost cold. My youngest son, Michael, had been equally evasive lately, always having excuses for why he couldn't talk for long. Even my daughter-in-law, Jessica, Michael's wife, who used to call me every week just to chat, had gone silent. I tried to shake off these thoughts. Maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe grief was making me see problems where none existed. But Tom always used to say I had good instincts, and right now, every instinct was screaming that something was wrong. Around noon, I made a decision that would change everything. I decided to drive by David's house just to check if Sarah was really sick. Maybe I could drop off some soup or medicine. It was only a 15-minute drive across town, and if nothing else, I could ease my worried mind. As I pulled into my car, I caught sight of myself in the rearview mirror. At 58, I still felt young, but the past 3 years had aged me. The lines around my green eyes were deeper, my auburn hair now streaked with silver that I'd stopped dyeing. I looked like what I was, a widow trying to hold on to what remained of her family. The drive to David's house took me through familiar neighborhoods where Tom and I had raised our children, past the elementary school where David had played Little League, past the park where we'd had countless birthday parties and family picnics. Each landmark felt like a ghost from a happier time. As I turned onto David Street, I noticed immediately that the house didn't look like the home of a sick family. The curtains were open, there were cars in the driveway, more cars than usual, actually. I could see movement in the backyard, and as I got closer, the unmistakable smell of grilling meat wafted through my open car window. My heart started pounding as I realized what I was seeing. They were having the BBQ without me. I parked across the street, hidden partially behind a large oak tree, and watched in stunned silence as my family, my children, their spouses, my grandchildren, laughed and played in the backyard I had helped design when David first bought the house. The same backyard where I had spent countless hours playing with my grandkids, teaching them to garden, creating memories I thought we all cherished. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't about Sarah being sick. This was deliberate exclusion. They had planned a family gathering and intentionally left me out, creating an elaborate lie to ensure I wouldn't show up uninvited. But why? What had I done wrong? What had I said or not said, done or not done, that made my own children want to celebrate without their mother? As I sat there, watching my family through the chain link fence, I realized this moment was going to divide my life into before and after. Before I knew the truth and after I discovered it, nothing would ever be the same again. I sat in my car for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, trying to process what I was witnessing. Through the gaps in the fence, I could see my granddaughter Emma, who's 12 now, wearing the bright yellow sundress I had bought her for her birthday last month. She was laughing at something her cousin Jake was saying, the same infectious laugh that always reminded me of her grandfather Tom. The scene looked like every family gathering we'd ever had, except for one glaring omission: me. Michael was manning the grill, wearing the world's greatest dad apron that Jessica had given him last Father's Day. I could see Sarah, who was supposedly sick, looking perfectly healthy as she carried a tray of what appeared to be her famous corn salad, the recipe she had learned from me. David was setting up the badminton net, something that had become a tradition at our gatherings after Tom introduced the game 5 years ago. Everything was exactly as it should be, except I wasn't there. The rational part of my mind tried to find innocent explanations. Maybe it was a last-minute decision. Maybe they thought I was too tired, or they were trying to spare me from something. But as I watched longer, I noticed details that painted a different picture. This wasn't a spontaneous gathering. The decorations were elaborate. There were balloons tied to the patio furniture, a banner hanging across the deck that I couldn't quite read from my position, and what looked like a professionally catered setup. This had been planned for weeks, maybe months. My phone rang, startling me from my surveillance. It was my daughter-in-law, Jessica. "Hi, Margaret, how are you doing today?" Her voice was artificially bright, the kind of forced cheerfulness people use when they're hiding something. "I'm fine, dear," I managed, my voice surprisingly steady despite the chaos in my heart. "Just disappointed about the BBQ being cancelled." "Oh yes, such a shame about Sarah being sick. But you know how these things spread. Better safe than sorry." I could literally see Jessica through the fence, standing in David's kitchen, gesturing animatedly while talking to me on the phone. The cognitive dissonance was almost unbearable. "Absolutely," I replied. "I hope she recovers quickly. Are you doing anything special today?" There was a brief pause, just long enough to make the lie obvious. "Oh, just relaxing at home." Michael's watching the game. You know how Sundays are. Except it was Saturday, and Michael was standing 15 feet away from her, flipping burgers. Well, I should let you get back to your relaxing Sunday, I said, unable to keep a slight edge from creeping into my voice. After hanging up, I sat there feeling like I was losing my mind. Had I gotten the day wrong? But no, David's text clearly said, "Today's BBQ." Had I misunderstood something fundamental about my relationship with my family? I started thinking back over the past few months, looking for clues I might have missed. There was David's birthday in March. He had said they were keeping it low-key, just immediate family. At the time, I had assumed that meant Sarah's parents would be there too, but now I wondered if immediate family had somehow stopped including me. There was Easter, when they had all gone to Jessica's parents' house instead of hosting at David's like we usually did. They said it was Jessica's turn to host for her side of the family, which seemed reasonable. But now I wondered if there had been a gathering here that I simply wasn't told about. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I had been gradually phased out of family events over the past year. It hadn't been sudden or dramatic, just a slow erosion of invitations, a gradual shift from being included to being informed after the fact. I remembered Tom's funeral, how my children had rallied around me, promising that nothing would change, that family would always come first. David had given a speech about how important it was to stick together, how Grandma Margaret was the heart of the family and they would make sure I never felt alone. Had those been empty words? Had they been counting down the days until they could resume their lives without the burden of including the grieving widow? My thoughts were interrupted by the sound of laughter from the backyard. I looked up to see my youngest grandson, 5-year-old Connor, running around with a water gun, completely soaked and delighted. Tom would have loved seeing this. He always said that children's laughter was the best sound in the world, but Tom wasn't here to see it, and apparently neither was I. I started my car, deciding I needed to leave before someone spotted me. As I drove away, I caught one last glimpse of the gathering in my rearview mirror. They looked like a complete family, happy, relaxed, natural. My absence hadn't created a void that needed filling. If anything, they seemed more relaxed without me there. The drive home was a blur of conflicting emotions. Hurt competed with anger. Confusion battled with a growing sense of clarity. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I had made a decision. I was going to find out the truth. I was going to understand why my own children felt the need to lie to me, to exclude me, to pretend I was still part of a family that had apparently moved on without me. I spent the rest of that Saturday afternoon sitting in Tom's old chair, staring at family photos that suddenly felt like evidence of a life that no longer existed. In every picture, I saw a woman who believed she was loved unconditionally by her children. Looking at those photos now felt like looking at someone else's life. The house felt bigger that night, emptier. The potato salad sat untouched in my refrigerator, a monument to my naivety. I had spent the morning preparing food for people who didn't want me at their table. As darkness fell, I made a list of all the recent family events I could remember. Birthday parties, holidays, casual get-togethers. How many had I actually been included in versus how many had I simply heard about afterward? The pattern was becoming clear, and it painted a picture that broke my heart. My children, the babies I had carried, the toddlers I had chased around playgrounds, the teenagers I had stayed up nights worrying about, the adults I had supported through marriages and career changes and parenthood, had decided they were better off without me. The question that haunted me as I finally went to bed that night wasn't just why they had excluded me. It was how long they had been planning it, and what they had been saying about me when I wasn't around to defend myself. Tomorrow, I decided I would start looking for answers. Tonight, I would mourn the family I thought I had, but apparently never did. Sunday morning arrived gray and drizzly, matching my mood perfectly. I had barely slept, my mind racing with questions and theories about what I had witnessed. I made coffee in the kitchen where Tom and I had shared thousands of morning conversations, but today the silence felt oppressive rather than peaceful. I decided to call my sister Linda, who lives in Phoenix. Linda has always been my confidant, the one person I could trust with my deepest fears and concerns. She's 2 years younger than me, but somehow always seems wiser about family dynamics. Margaret, how was the BBQ yesterday? Did Emma like the books you picked out for her? Her question hit me like a punch to the gut. I had completely forgotten that I had told Linda about the BBQ, about how excited I was to give Emma the Nancy Drew collection I had found at an estate sale. Linda, I said, my voice cracking slightly. Something happened yesterday that I need to talk about. I told her everything. The cancelled BBQ text, my decision to drive by the house, what I had seen, Jessica's phone call filled with lies. Linda listened in complete silence, which was unusual for her. Normally she would interject with questions or comments, but this time she just let me talk. When I finished, there was a long pause. Margaret, she finally said, her voice gentle but serious, I need to tell you something and you're not going to like it. My heart started pounding. What do you mean? Jessica called me last month. She said the family was concerned about you, about some things you've been doing and saying. She asked if I had noticed any changes in your behavior since Tom died. The world seemed to tilt sideways. What kind of changes? What things? She said you've been showing up at their houses unannounced, that you call constantly, that you get upset when they can't drop everything to see you. She said they feel like they can't breathe, like you're too dependent on them. I felt like I had been slapped. I haven't been doing any of those things, Linda. I call once a week, maybe twice. I only visit when I'm invited or when there's an emergency. I know, honey. That's what I told her. I said, you've always been respectful of boundaries, that if anything, you've been too independent since Tom died. But she seemed convinced that you were becoming clingy, was the word she used. Clingy. The word stung because it was so far from how I saw myself. If anything, I had been careful not to be a burden on my children. I had gone out of my way to build my own life, to find my own sources of support and entertainment. Did she say anything else? Linda hesitated. She asked if Tom's death had affected your mental state. She suggested that maybe you weren't seeing situations clearly anymore, that grief might be making you more needy than you realized. The implication was clear. They had been discussing my mental health behind my back, painting me as a pathetic, dependent widow who couldn't cope with reality. Linda, I need you to be completely honest with me. Have you noticed anything concerning about my behavior? Absolutely not, Margaret. You've been handling Tom's death with incredible grace. You've built new friendships, you volunteer at the library, you've taken up painting. If anything, I've been impressed by how well you've adapted to being on your own. After we hung up, I sat in my living room trying to process this new information. My family hadn't just excluded me from yesterday's gathering. They had been systematically building a case against me, portraying me as mentally unstable and overly dependent. But why? What did they gain from pushing me away? I decided to do some detective work. I opened my laptop and started going through my phone records, looking at call logs and text messages. The evidence was clear. I had called David twice in the past month, both times briefly and about specific topics. I had called Michael once to ask about his promotion at work. I had texted Jessica a few times, mostly responses to photos she had sent of the kids. None of this constituted harassment or excessive contact. Next, I looked at my calendar, trying to remember the last time I had shown up anywhere unannounced. The only instance I could think of was 3 months ago, when I had stopped by David's house because I was in the neighborhood and had some of Emma's artwork that she had left at my house. I had called first, but no one answered, so I left the drawings on the front porch with a note, hardly the behavior of a clingy, mentally unstable person. I started thinking about the timeline. When had this narrative about my behavior begun? Jessica's call to Linda was last month, but the gradual exclusion from family events had started earlier. I pulled out my day planner and started marking family gatherings I had attended versus those I had learned about after the fact. The pattern became clear around 6 months ago. That was when David's job had required him to travel more, when Michael and Jessica had started their home renovation project, when Sarah had begun her master's degree program. Life had gotten busier for everyone, but instead of adjusting as a family, they had apparently decided the easiest solution was to simply cut me out. But there had to be more to it than convenience. You don't systematically exclude a family member and create elaborate lies unless there's a deeper issue. I decided to call my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who had been friendly with our family for years. She often saw my children when they visited, and I thought she might have insights I was missing. "Oh, Margaret, I'm so glad you called. I've been meaning to check on you. I noticed you didn't have your usual crowd over for the weekend." "Actually, Mrs. Patterson, that's what I wanted to talk to you about. Have you noticed anything unusual about my family's visits lately?" She paused thoughtfully. "Well, now that you mention it, I did think it was odd when David and Sarah came by last weekend to pick up that box from your garage, but you weren't home. Usually when family visits, you're there to chat with them." My blood went cold. "What box?" "I'm not sure exactly. David had a key and they loaded something into their truck. I assumed you knew about it since he had a key. David did have a key to my house. We had exchanged keys years ago for emergencies, but he had never used it to come by when I wasn't home, and he certainly had never mentioned picking anything up last weekend." "Did you see what they took?" "It looked like a large storage box, maybe some other things too. They were here for about an hour. After hanging up with Mrs. Patterson, I went straight to my garage. I kept it meticulously organized, and I immediately noticed what was missing. The large plastic container where I stored family memorabilia was gone. Photo albums, Tom's military medals, my grandmother's jewelry, important documents, everything that connected our family history was missing. They hadn't just excluded me from family gatherings. They had been systematically removing traces of family history from my possession. But why would they take these things without asking? And why would they lie about Sarah being sick while simultaneously committing what amounted to theft? I sat on my garage floor, surrounded by the gaps where my family's history used to be, and realized that whatever was happening was bigger and more calculated than simple social exclusion. My children weren't just pulling away from me. They were actively working to erase my connection to the family entirely. The question now was, what were they planning to do next? Monday morning, I woke up with a clarity that surprised me. The confusion and hurt of the past few days had crystallized into something more powerful: determination. I was going to get to the bottom of this, no matter what it took. I started by calling my bank. If my children were planning something that involved family assets or legal matters, there might be financial indicators I could track. What I discovered made my stomach drop. "Mrs. Morrison, I see here that you've had several inquiries about your accounts in the past 2 months," the customer service representative told me. "Someone called asking about your beneficiaries, your joint account holders, and whether you had any recent changes to your estate planning." "I never made those calls," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "The calls came from a David Morrison, who identified himself as your son. He provided your social security number and some personal information, so we assumed it was legitimate family inquiry. He said he was helping you organize your financial records. I hung up feeling nauseated. David had been investigating my finances behind my back. Combined with the missing family memorabilia, this suggested they were planning something that required knowledge of my assets and legal documents. My next call was to my attorney, Robert Chen, who had handled Tom's estate and my updated will after his death. Margaret, I'm glad you called. I was actually going to reach out to you this week. Your son Michael came by last Friday asking for copies of your will and power of attorney documents. He said you were having some memory issues and wanted to make sure everything was in order. The lies were becoming more elaborate and more damaging. Robert, I haven't had any memory issues. I never asked Michael to review my legal documents. There was a long pause. Margaret, I think you need to come in as soon as possible. There are some things we need to discuss. I was at Robert's office within an hour. He's a man in his 60s who has known our family for 15 years, and I could see the concern in his eyes as I sat across from his desk. Margaret, your family has been painting a very different picture of your mental state than what I'm seeing right now. Michael specifically mentioned that you've been forgetting conversations, repeating yourself, and showing signs of what he called early cognitive decline. None of that is true, Robert. I'm sharper now than I've been since Tom's death. I'm managing my finances, my household, my volunteer work. Everything is under control. He leaned back in his chair, studying me carefully. That's exactly what I told Michael. You've never shown any signs of cognitive issues in our interactions. In fact, you've been remarkably clear-headed about complex legal and financial matters. What exactly did Michael want? He was asking about the process for establishing guardianship or conservatorship. He said the family was concerned about your ability to make sound decisions about your care and your finances. The room started spinning. Guardianship. They weren't just trying to exclude me from family gatherings. They were trying to take control of my entire life. Robert, can they do that? Can they have me declared incompetent? It's a complex legal process that requires substantial evidence of incapacity. But, Margaret, if they're coordinating their efforts, if they have documentation of concerning incidents, if they present a united front to a judge, it becomes possible. I thought about Jessica's call to my sister Linda, about the narrative they were building of me as clingy and mentally unstable. They weren't just creating that story for their own justification. They were building a legal case. What would happen if they succeeded? They could gain control over your finances, your medical decisions, your living situation. They could sell your house, move you to a care facility, essentially control every aspect of your life. The motivation was becoming clear. My house alone was worth nearly $800,000, and I had substantial retirement savings. With Tom's life insurance and investments, my estate was worth well over $1 million. If they could have me declared incompetent, they could control all of it. But I still couldn't understand why they thought they needed to go to such extremes. I had always planned to leave everything to my children anyway. Why not just wait for natural inheritance? Robert, I need to ask you something confidential. In my current will, who inherits what? He consulted his files. Your estate is divided equally among your 3 children, David, Michael, and Jennifer. Jennifer, my daughter who lived in Seattle, who I hadn't spoken to in over a year. She had moved across the country after a bitter divorce, claiming she needed a fresh start. But now I wondered if her distance from the family was more intentional than I had realized. Have you heard from Jennifer recently? Actually, yes. She called last week asking about the same documents. She said she was flying in this weekend to help coordinate your care. Jennifer was coming to town, and I hadn't heard from her directly. This was clearly a coordinated effort involving all three of my children. I left Robert's office with a plan. I had until the weekend to figure out exactly what they were planning and to prepare my defense. But first, I needed to understand how deep this conspiracy went. My next stop was the assisted living facility across town where my friend Martha had moved last year. I had visited her there several times and remembered being impressed by how nice the facility was. But now I wondered if my children had been researching it for different reasons. The receptionist, a young woman named Amy, recognized me immediately. "Mrs. Morrison, how nice to see you again. Are you here to visit Martha?" Actually, I was wondering if anyone from my family had been by recently asking about your services. Her face lit up. "Oh yes, your son was here just last week. Such a thoughtful young man, asking about our memory care unit and our admission process. He said you two had been discussing options for the future." Memory care unit. They had been researching facilities specifically designed for people with dementia and Alzheimer's disease. Did he leave any paperwork or make any arrangements? He filled out some preliminary paperwork and asked about our financial requirements. He mentioned that you might be interested in touring the facility soon. I thanked Amy and left, my mind reeling. They weren't just planning to have me declared incompetent. They had already chosen where they wanted to place me. As I drove home, I started putting together the timeline. The gradual exclusion from family events was phase 1. Establishing emotional distance and creating a narrative of my declining social skills. The investigation into my finances and legal documents was phase 2. Understanding exactly what assets they would gain control over. Phase 3 was building a case for incompetency with supposed evidence of memory issues and poor judgment. This weekend, when Jennifer arrived, would likely be phase 4. The confrontation where they would present me with their concerns and pressure me to voluntarily sign over power of attorney, or failing that, begin legal proceedings to have me declared incompetent. It was a sophisticated long-term plan that would have worked perfectly if I hadn't accidentally discovered the cancelled BBQ. But now I knew what they were planning, and I had several days to prepare my counterattack. The question was, did I want to salvage my relationship with my children, or did I want to make them pay for their betrayal? As I pulled into my driveway, I realized that for the first time since Tom's death, I felt truly alive. The grief that had clouded my judgment for 3 years was gone, replaced by a sharp, clear anger that would serve me well in the battle ahead. My children thought they were dealing with a weak, dependent widow. They were about to discover they had underestimated their mother. Friday evening arrived with the kind of autumn chill that makes you want to stay inside with a warm cup of tea. But I wasn't planning on a quiet evening at home. I had spent the week preparing for what I knew would be the most important confrontation of my life. I had contacted 3 character witnesses, my volunteer coordinator at the library, my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, and my doctor, all of whom were prepared to testify to my mental competency. I had gathered bank statements, appointment calendars, and documentation of my daily activities. Most importantly, I had installed a small recording device that Robert had recommended, ensuring that whatever happened this weekend would be documented. Jennifer arrived first around 6 p.m. I watched from my kitchen window as she got out of her rental car, looking around the neighborhood with what appeared to be an appraiser's eye. She had always been the most calculating of my children, even as a little girl. Tom used to joke that she would negotiate the terms of her bedtime story. When she knocked on the door, I took a deep breath and opened it with a smile. "Jennifer, what a wonderful surprise. I had no idea you were coming to visit." She hugged me, but it felt perfunctory, like a business transaction. "Hi, Mom. I know it's last minute, but I wanted to spend some time with you. I've been worried. Worried about what, sweetheart? Just things. David and Michael have mentioned some concerns. I led her into the living room, the same room where she had opened Christmas presents and played board games with her brothers. What kind of concerns? Jennifer sat on the edge of the couch, her posture tense. They think you might be having some difficulties adjusting to being on your own. They mentioned some forgetfulness, some confusion about plans and schedules. I maintained my calm exterior while my interior raged. I'm not aware of any forgetfulness or confusion. Can you give me specific examples? Well, like last weekend when you thought there was a family BBQ when it had been cancelled. Interesting. So they had already coordinated their story about Saturday's events. Jennifer, I received a text from David saying the BBQ was postponed due to Sarah's illness, but when I drove by the house to drop off soup for her, I discovered that the BBQ was actually happening. Everyone was there except me. Jennifer's face remained carefully neutral, but I caught a flicker of surprise. Mom, that's not what happened. David said you got confused about the date and showed up when nothing was planned. Would you like to see the text message? I pulled out my phone and showed her David's message. Jennifer read it and I watched her mental calculations as she tried to figure out how to spin this new information. Maybe there was a miscommunication, she said finally. Or maybe there was a deliberate lie. Before Jennifer could respond, we heard cars pulling into the driveway. Through the window, I could see David's truck and Michael's sedan. The entire family was here for whatever they had planned. The doorbell rang, and I opened it to find all four of them, David, Sarah, Michael, and Jessica, standing on my porch like some sort of intervention team. Mom, David said with exaggerated cheerfulness. We thought we'd surprise you with a family visit. How lovely, I replied, stepping aside to let them in. Jennifer and I were just having an interesting conversation about communication and honesty. They filed into my living room and I could feel the tension radiating from the group. Sarah was carrying a folder of paperwork. Michael had what looked like legal documents, and Jessica was holding a tablet computer. Mom, Michael began, settling into Tom's old chair, we need to have a serious conversation. We're all worried about you. All of you, including Jennifer, who I haven't spoken to in over a year. Jennifer cleared her throat. Mom, I know I haven't been in touch as much as I should have, but when David and Michael called me about their concerns, I knew I had to come. What concerns, specifically? David leaned forward, adopting what I recognized as his serious businessman pose. Mom, we think you're having some memory issues. You've been forgetting conversations, getting confused about dates and plans. Last week you called me 3 times asking the same question. Which question was that? David paused, clearly not expecting me to ask for specifics about Dad's life insurance policy. David, I haven't called you once about your father's life insurance. I have all the documentation right here. I pulled out a folder I had prepared. Would you like to see the call log from my phone showing exactly when and why I've contacted each of you? Sarah opened her folder and pulled out several sheets of paper. Mrs. Morrison, we've been documenting incidents of concerning behavior, showing up at houses unannounced, repetitive phone calls, confusion about family events. I'd like to see that documentation. Sarah handed me the papers and I read through them with growing amazement at their creativity. According to their records, I had called David 15 times in 1 week, actually twice, showed up at Michael's house at midnight demanding to be let in, never happened, and become agitated and confused during a family dinner that supposedly took place 3 weeks ago, a dinner I was never invited to. This is quite creative, I said, setting the papers aside. Unfortunately, it's also completely fabricated. Jessica spoke up, her voice gentle but firm. Margaret, sometimes people experiencing cognitive decline aren't aware of their behavior. It's very common for Jessica, I interrupted, I'm going to stop you right there. I know exactly what's happening here, and it's not cognitive decline. I stood up and walked to my mantelpiece where I had strategically placed some documents. I know that David has been calling my bank to inquire about my accounts. I know that Michael visited my attorney asking about guardianship proceedings. I know that someone has been researching memory care facilities and even filled out preliminary paperwork for my admission. The room went completely silent. I could see them exchanging glances, trying to figure out how I had discovered their plan. I also know that items have been removed from my home without my permission. Family photographs, important documents, heirloom jewelry, all taken during visits when I wasn't here. Sarah's face had gone pale. We were just trying to help organize. You were stealing from me while building a legal case to have me declared incompetent so you could gain control of my estate. David stood up, his face flushed with anger. Mom, you're being paranoid. We're trying to help you because we love you. If you loved me, you wouldn't have excluded me from family gatherings while lying about why. If you loved me, you wouldn't have spent months building a false case against my mental health. If you loved me, you would have talked to me directly instead of conspiring behind my back. Michael tried a different approach. Mom, we know this is hard to hear, but Dad's death affected you more than you realize. You've become dependent on us in ways that aren't healthy. We think some professional help and a more structured living situation would be good for you. What I think, I said, looking at each of them in turn, is that you saw an opportunity to get your inheritance early while having convenient excuses for your behavior. Easier to claim I'm incompetent than to admit you're greedy. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Jennifer was the first to speak. Mom, that's not fair. We've all been successful in our own careers. We don't need your money. Then why go to such elaborate lengths to get control of it? The question created another uncomfortable silence. Finally, David stood up and grabbed the folder from Sarah. Mom, we've prepared some paperwork that would make things easier for everyone. A power of attorney that would allow us to help manage your affairs, and some information about assisted living facilities that might be a good fit for you. Absolutely not. Mom, be reasonable. You can't live in this big house forever. You're isolated here, and if something happened, nothing is going to happen that I can't handle, and I'm not isolated. I have friends, activities, a full life that you would know about if you had bothered to stay involved instead of plotting against me. I walked over to my desk and pulled out my own folder. Since we're sharing paperwork, I have some of my own. Character references from my doctor, my volunteer coordinator, and my neighbors. Bank statements showing I'm managing my finances perfectly well. Phone records proving that your documentation of my behavior is fabricated. And a recording of this entire conversation. The last revelation hit them like a physical blow. Sarah actually gasped. You recorded us? I protected myself from false accusations, which, based on the lies you've been telling, was clearly necessary. And David's businessman mask finally slipped, revealing real anger underneath. Fine, Mom, you want to play hardball? We're filing for guardianship whether you cooperate or not. And when a judge sees the evidence we've compiled, evidence you fabricated, they'll see that you're not competent to manage your own affairs. I smiled, feeling calmer than I had in weeks. David, I think you should be more concerned about the evidence I've compiled. Did you know that filing false documentation in guardianship proceedings is a felony? That bank fraud and theft carry serious criminal penalties? The room erupted in protests and accusations, but I held up my hand for silence. Here's what's going to happen. You're all going to leave my house right now. You're going to return every item you've taken. And you're going to abandon this ridiculous scheme. Or what? Michael challenged. "Or I file criminal charges against all of you, change my will to leave everything to charity, and you get nothing but legal bills and public humiliation." Jennifer stood up slowly. "Mom, you're being unreasonable. We're family." "No," I said, meeting her eyes. "Family doesn't do what you've done to me. You stopped being my family the moment you decided to treat me like an enemy to be defeated rather than a mother to be loved." They filed out of my house in angry silence, leaving me alone in my living room surrounded by the detritus of their failed scheme. For the first time in 3 years, I felt truly free. 3 months have passed since that confrontational Friday evening, and I'm recording this final chapter from my home office, the same room where Tom used to pay bills and where I now manage what has become a surprisingly busy and fulfilling life. The immediate aftermath of that confrontation was exactly what you might expect. David called the next morning, threatening legal action and claiming I had misunderstood their intentions. Michael sent a long email detailing all the ways I was being unfair and unreasonable. Jennifer simply disappeared back to Seattle without another word. But I held firm to my ultimatum, and gradually the stolen items began appearing on my doorstep. Photo albums left on the porch in the early morning hours, Tom's military medals in an unmarked envelope, my grandmother's jewelry in a small box with no note. They returned everything except something I hadn't even realized was missing until I went through the recovered items carefully: my original birth certificate and social security card. When I called Robert about it, he explained that these documents would have been necessary for certain legal proceedings. The fact that they hadn't returned them suggested they might still be considering their options. I decided to take a proactive approach to protecting myself. I updated my will with very specific language about competency challenges. I established relationships with 3 different doctors who could testify to my mental acuity. Most importantly, I hired a private investigator named Frank Martinez to document my daily activities and create an ongoing record of my competency. Frank turned out to be more than just professional security. He became a friend. A former police detective in his early 60s, he had started his own investigation firm after retiring from the Denver Police Department. When I first contacted him, I was expecting someone who would simply gather evidence for potential legal proceedings. Instead, I found someone who understood family dynamics and the particular vulnerabilities of older adults. "Mrs. Morrison," he told me during our first meeting, "I've seen this kind of thing more often than you might think. Adult children who convince themselves they're acting in their parents' best interest while serving their own financial needs. The key is documentation and building a support network that can't be easily dismissed." Frank helped me establish what he called a competency insurance policy: regular mental health evaluations, financial planning consultations, and social activity documentation. But more than that, he encouraged me to build the kind of life that would make any claims of isolation or dependence obviously false. That's how I ended up joining the Mountain View Community Theater Group, something I had considered doing for years but never quite found the courage to try. At 58, I figured I was too old to start performing, but the group welcomed me enthusiastically. I started in the costume department and gradually worked my way up to small speaking roles. Theater people, I discovered, are wonderfully accepting of anyone willing to work hard and show up consistently. Within a month, I had made more genuine friends than I had maintained in the previous 3 years. Sarah Kim, the director, became a particular ally. She's a retired drama teacher in her 70s who has no patience for family drama or artificial barriers. "Margaret," she told me after I shared some of my story, "the best revenge against people who want to diminish you is to live so fully that their diminishment becomes impossible." I also started volunteering more extensively at the Denver Public Library, moving beyond my usual bookshelving duties to help with their literacy program for adults. Teaching reading to people who had missed educational opportunities early in life turned out to be incredibly rewarding. My students ranged from recent immigrants to older adults who had struggled with undiagnosed learning disabilities their entire lives. One student in particular, Maria Santos, became special to me. She's a grandmother in her 50s who came to the United States from Guatemala 20 years ago, but had never learned to read English fluently. Watching her progress from struggling with basic words to reading entire novels has been one of the most fulfilling experiences of my life. "Mrs. Margaret," she told me recently, "you gave me the gift of stories. Now I can read to my grandchildren." So, these new relationships and activities created something my children's scheme couldn't account for. Witnesses to my competency who had no financial interest in the outcome. Frank documented everything meticulously, creating a portfolio that would make any guardianship challenge extremely difficult to pursue. But the most significant development came from an unexpected source. About 6 weeks after the confrontation, I received a call from someone I hadn't spoken to in over 2 decades, my former daughter-in-law, Rebecca. She had been married to David for 8 years before their divorce, and she was Emma's biological mother. After the divorce, David had made it difficult for Rebecca to maintain contact with our family, and eventually, the relationship had faded entirely. "Margaret," she said when I answered the phone, "I hope you don't mind me calling. Emma asked me to reach out to you." Emma, my granddaughter who I hadn't spoken to since before the canceled BBQ. "Rebecca, it's wonderful to hear from you. How is Emma?" She's confused and upset. David told her that you were sick and couldn't have visitors anymore, but she doesn't understand why she can't even call you. The manipulation extended even to my relationship with my granddaughter. David had told Emma that I was ill rather than explaining that he had chosen to cut contact. "Would you like to have lunch sometime?" Rebecca asked. "Emma would love to see you, and frankly, I'd like to understand what's been happening. Some of the things I've heard don't sound like the Margaret I remember." We met the following Saturday at a restaurant downtown, and I was amazed by how much Emma had grown and changed. At 12, she was becoming a young woman with her own opinions and a sharp intelligence that reminded me of her grandfather Tom. "Grandma Margaret," she said within minutes of sitting down, "Dad said you were sick, but you look fine to me." "I'm not sick, sweetheart. Sometimes adults have disagreements that are hard to explain." And Rebecca asked me directly what had happened with David and his siblings, and I found myself telling the whole story to someone who knew my family well enough to understand the dynamics involved. "That sounds exactly like David," Rebecca said when I finished. "During our divorce, he tried to convince everyone that I was unstable and an unfit mother. He's very good at building narratives that serve his purposes." Emma looked back and forth between us, clearly trying to understand adult complexities that were beyond her years. "Grandma Margaret, can I still visit you? I miss our baking days." Before our monthly BBQs had started, Emma and I used to have regular baking sessions where I taught her family recipes, and we talked about everything from school troubles to her dreams for the future. I had assumed those days were over. "Of course you can visit, but it would have to be with your mom's permission since your dad has decided we shouldn't see each other right now." Rebecca reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Margaret, Emma spends every other weekend with me, and some weekdays too. I would be happy to facilitate visits between you two." That was how I got my granddaughter back, and in the process, rebuilt a relationship with Rebecca that became one of the most positive aspects of my new life. She's a successful nurse practitioner now, remarried to a kind man named James who treats Emma like his own daughter. Through them, I gained not just access to Emma, but also a found family that actually wanted me around. Rebecca also provided crucial information about David's financial situation that helped explain his sudden interest in my estate. He had made some poor investment decisions and taken on significant debt to maintain the lifestyle he wanted to project. My estate represented a solution to problems I hadn't even known he had. As winter turned to spring, I found myself busier and happier than I had been since Tom's death. My days were filled with theater rehearsals, literacy tutoring, visits with Emma, and social activities with new friends. Frank continued documenting everything, but it became less about legal protection and more about capturing evidence of a life well lived. The final piece of my new life fell into place in an entirely unexpected way. I was at the library one Tuesday morning, working with Maria on a particularly challenging text, when a man approached our table. He was tall and distinguished looking, probably in his early 60s, with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Excuse me," he said. "I couldn't help but notice your teaching technique. I'm wondering if you might have room for another student." His name was Dr. James Mitchell, and he had recently retired from teaching history at the University of Colorado. He explained that he had severe dyslexia that had never been properly addressed in his childhood education, and while he had learned to compensate professionally, he still struggled with reading for pleasure. "I can read academic texts just fine," he told me, "but I've never been able to enjoy a novel without significant effort." I thought maybe it was time to finally address that gap. Working with James was different from working with other students because of his educational background and life experience. Our sessions became as much conversation as instruction, covering everything from literature to history to personal philosophy. When he mentioned that he was recently widowed, having lost his wife Eleanor to cancer 2 years earlier, I felt a kinship with his grief experience. "The hardest part," he told me one day, "isn't the loneliness. It's the feeling that all the shared experiences and inside jokes and little traditions died with her. Like half my life became irrelevant overnight." I understood exactly what he meant. Our relationship evolved gradually, from teacher-student to friends to something more. James never tried to replace Tom in my heart, and I never tried to replace Eleanor in his. Instead, we created something new, a partnership between two people who had lived full lives and found themselves with the opportunity to build something together in their later years. 6 months after that disastrous family confrontation, James asked me to marry him. We were sitting in my garden, which we had been working on together, surrounded by the vegetables and flowers we had planted as spring turned to summer. "Margaret," he said, "I know this might seem fast, but at our age, why waste time? I love you, and I think we could have a wonderful life together." I said yes immediately, surprising myself with how certain I felt. We married in a small ceremony at the community theater, surrounded by friends who had become like family. Emma was my maid of honor, Rebecca officiated as a licensed celebrant, Frank walked me down the aisle, and Maria read a poem she had written for the occasion. None of my biological children attended. I sent them invitations but never received responses. The wedding reception was everything a family celebration should be, full of laughter, dancing, genuine affection, and people who were there because they wanted to be, not because they felt obligated. As I write this final chapter, James is in the kitchen making his famous lasagna while I finish documenting this story. Emma is coming for dinner tonight, and tomorrow we're having Maria and her family over for a barbecue. Next week, I start rehearsals for the theater's production of The Tempest, where I'll be playing Prospero's spirit Ariel. Not bad for someone whose own children thought was too incompetent to manage her own life. I still live in the house Tom and I shared, but it feels different now. Instead of being a museum to a life that ended, it's become the foundation for a life that's still beginning. James has moved in, bringing his books and his piano and his gentle presence to rooms that had been too quiet for too long. Do I miss my children? The relationship we had, yes. The people they've chosen to become, no. I've learned that family isn't just about blood relationships or legal obligations. It's about people who choose to love and support each other, who show up when needed, who celebrate successes and provide comfort during difficulties. My found family does all of those things. My biological family tried to rob me of my autonomy, my dignity, and my assets. The choice about which family to invest in seems obvious. Sometimes people ask me if I think my children will ever apologize or try to rebuild our relationship. Honestly, I don't spend much energy thinking about it. I've learned that waiting for people to change or recognize their mistakes is a waste of the precious time I have left. Instead, I focus on the people who value me as I am, on activities that bring me joy, on building something positive rather than dwelling on what was lost or stolen. If David, Michael, and Jennifer ever decide they want a real relationship with me, one based on respect and genuine affection rather than financial opportunism, I'll consider it. But they'll have to prove that they fundamentally changed their approach to family relationships. Until then, I'm busy living the life they tried to take away from me. And I've never been happier. If you're watching this and you recognize yourself in any part of this story, whether you're someone being manipulated by family members or someone who has been taking advantage of a loved one, I hope you'll take action to change the dynamic. Life is too short to spend it in relationships that diminish rather than enhance your existence. Choose the people who choose you. Build the family you deserve. And never let anyone convince you that you're less capable than you know yourself to be. Thank you for listening to my story. Remember to like and subscribe if this resonated with you, and please share it with anyone who might need to hear it. Sometimes the family we create is better than the family we're born into, and that's perfectly okay. Peso final character count 60 to 47 characters.